Okay, so we'll start with some background on environmental philosophy. So as you can see on this first slide, we need to talk a little bit about something called consequentialism and something called deontology. Now, these are just generic terms for a particular philosophical view. And the reason for starting with it is that cost-benefit analysis and similar economic methods rely on the philosophy of consequentialism. This, in simple terms, just means that when you take an action, when you promote a project or a policy, idea of consequentialism is that in order to decide if that policy or project was a reasonable choice to make, you need to look at the consequences. And in cost-benefit analysis, we make these consequences into costs and benefits, gains and losses, and we look at how to find net gains from a particular project or course of action. So that's what consequentialism means. You judge whether something's right or wrong, good or bad, in terms of its consequences. Now, in environmental management contexts, lots of environmental scientists don't accept consequentialism as the only philosophical position, and they tend to look at what are called ontological positions. Now, this looks at what's right or wrong, what's a good idea or bad idea in terms of rules and norms. And so ontology sets a rule, and then you decide whether your project or course of action is in line or meets that rule or doesn't meet the rule. And typically, ecological economists quite like rules. And we'll come to sustainability rules later on in this talk. Okay, so philosophically, then there are two main strands of thought: consequentialism and ontology. And typically, economic cost-benefit analysis is reliant on consequentialism. Okay. The other issues we've got to think about are that when we look at economic valuation, we're looking at an individualist approach. We're looking at individual preferences and perspective of the individual, whereas again in ecological economics, one often wants to look at the perspective from a collective viewpoint. So how does society judge whether things are good or bad? In the individualism perspective, economics typically assume that individuals have self-interested preferences, that they are interested in their own consumption of goods and services, and not particularly interested in other people's consumption of goods and services. Whereas again, in ecological economics, analysts tend to want to broaden the type of preferences that people have to include what's called other regarding preferences, where my actions judged by me, not just in my own self-interest, but how it might affect other people in society. And you'll see that sustainability rules often include what are called other regarding preferences. Okay, what we'll also look at is the tools and methods that we use in decision support systems. So cost-benefit analysis, multi-criteria analysis. Now that also brings in another set of issues. Underneath cost-benefit analysis, or other forms of decision making, economists talk about the social welfare function. This very simply is a set of assumptions about the type of society that the economics is dealing with. And social welfare function for conventional economics relates back to self-interested preferences, whereas the social welfare function in sustainability analysis might look at fairness and equity as an assumption. And then finally, whenever we deal with nature services, we have a series of intangible that we have to deal with. Right. Okay. So just to set the scene for these decision-making contexts, start with the macroeconomic conditions. So before we can look at individual projects or policies, we need to think a little bit about what type of economy and society we're dealing with when we introduce these projects and policies. So typically, economists spend a lot of time calculating economic growth, so gross domestic product, and looking at stocks of capital and wealth. Now, what we'll see when we come to environmental economics is we want to include in these capital stocks natural capital, nature, and ecosystem systems. Because GDP as an indicator is a fairly accurate reflection of economic activity in society, but not necessarily people's welfare. And sustainable development, needs to include social welfare measures alongside economic activity. So I'll say a little bit about the two forms of sustainable development. So we're looking at the economy growing over time, developing over time. If our objective is a weak sustainable development objective, then basically going to assume that different parts of total capital stock can substitute for each. So what this translates into is that if we lose some natural capital, if we lose some biodiversity, the argument might be that we can replace that loss with other forms of capital. And if you think about agricultural development historically, then that's what we've done. We've substituted physical capital and human capital alongside natural capital to increase productivity of activity. So weak sustainability thinks that various forms of capital have more or less substitution ability. Now, the ecological economics perspective, weak sustainability position isn't sufficient to count as sustainable growth or and from an ecological economics position, analysts would want to persuade you you need to have strong sustainability objectives. Under strong sustainability, the assumption is that many aspects of nature and the environment are not substitutable one for another. And so if we started to lose the support systems in our environment, it would be very difficult or at least very expensive in resource terms to pay back. Strong sustainability doesn't see as many substitution possibilities as weak sustainability. So those are the the two sustainability positions that currently are debated in political circles. What it means for the social welfare function is that we need to think about not just self-interested preferences of individuals, maybe other regarding preferences across society and equity and fairness criteria. So in weak sustainable development, we will be looking to pass across from one generation to the next a value of capital that is at least constant, hopefully increasing, but at least constant. Whereas under strong sustainability assumptions, we will be passing across from one generation to the next a physical capital stock that shouldn't be depleted if you can't find substitution measures. The other issue that ecological economists want to emphasize under strong sustainability is that threshold effects, tipping points, and irreversible actions are all dangers when you overemphasize or you're too optimistic about sustainable development and substitution. And in these cases, strong sustainability has a risk-averse element in that until you know for sure scientifically, then you shouldn't undertake some actions in case of a threshold effect or an irreversibility. Okay, so that gives us the basic difference between weak and strong development. Now we have to think about how we can include nature and the environment more formally into decision support systems, into key accounts and other economic measures. And one of the mechanisms we use for that is called the ecosystem service approach, where we're looking at natural capital, landscape, wetlands, forests, not just in terms of their natural capabilities, but in the economic services that they might provide to society. It's the ecosystem service. So any given amount of natural capital, a forest or a wetland, can over time produce a flow of ecosystem services. And one of the issues that economists grapple with is, can we, and in what way can we put a monetary value to these ecosystems? Okay. Most recently, the work on economic growth and sustainable development has come to look at a concept called circular economy, which we try to make use of all resources, including nature, as efficiently as possible. In particular, we are worried about the waste disposal capacity of the environment and how we might better utilize resources in order to reduce waste and pollution. And then finally, in the talk, I'll talk a little bit about the problem that any one person calls a value, and the value of nature might be different from another person's conception of value. Okay, so here's a very simple picture about circular economy. So what my argument here is that if we are looking from a macroeconomic perspective and thinking about development over time, then maybe an argument should be that we should be trying to reform our economy into something more like this circular economy idea. Now, what I've done in the picture is to use the typical circular economy argument in the middle of the diagram. So trying to use resources more efficiently. We're trying to secure resource supply. And we're going to do this through methods such as waste recycling, product durability, reducing waste, using waste products more efficiently for energy or in other ways. So we essentially keep materials and energy inside the economic system in a circular flow, and therefore reduce the amount of matter and energy we emit in the atmosphere, or dump in oceans, or put in landfill sites. So the circular economy started out as an idea to maximize resource use, maximize and make management issues as cost effective as possible. More recently, analysts have the idea that the circular economy isn't enough if we are serious about meeting sustainable development goals, and that we have to add other constraints into the circular economy. And so what you'll see in the diagram is that the circular economy is growing through time, but to make it sustainable progress through time, we limit its expansion, or up the diagram in terms of environmental limits, and down the diagram in terms of social limits. So very quickly, what do we mean by this? Well, inside the circular economy, we're trying to reduce as much as possible pollution and waste production. The environment is setting in terms of, for example, CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, toxic pollution into water courses, nutrient pollution from agriculture into water courses. And the environmental limits idea is till we're absolutely certain about the science, the amount of pollution, therefore the amount of economic activity going on, reduced. Okay, so that's an environmental limit. So trying to grow the economy through time, but within the limits that we have set by the environment. Yep. So is that better now? Is that better to hear? Okay. So then the other limits involved, bottom of the diagram, are called social limits. And this takes economics out of efficiency analysis and challenges it in fairness and equity and justice. The argument is that a sustainable economy over time, adopting circular economy principles, be very careful about the degree of inequality. And what we've learned in recent years, if the economy and the society become more unequal, inequality measure is increasing, the likelihood is that aside from social and ethical problems, the value we put on the environment is likely to go down. This obviously something we don't want. Okay. I'll try again. Is that better?
Yes. When they speak.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think he needs to get closer to the microphone.
Okay.
Closer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Harry, I guess that when you speak, there are gaps in your sentences. So if you try to speak slightly slower, it might be easier.
And closer to the microphone.
Or maybe just closer to the microphone. Let's try this way, and otherwise we can try switching off the video or something.
Okay, so now I'm talking right across the microphone. Is that better?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Sorry about that. I will. I'll hold it up. Okay. When I get exhausted, I'll drop it. Okay. So we were talking about the circular economy and how it operates within limits, environmental limits to limit pollution and resource degradation, and social limits to try and reduce inequality in the system. There's another good reason from economics to be worried about inequality, and that is where a society is becoming more unequal, quite often it's a problem of economic efficiency. And inefficient resource use often goes with inequality. Okay, so that's the macroeconomic background. Now we'll come to the micro side of things and look at how we put economic value on ecosystem services and natural capital. Economists typically use the term total economic value, and they split this into two components: use value and non-use value. Use values are fairly easy to understand. We make use of the environment, and therefore we put value on it directly by using ecosystem services. We get use value indirectly by looking at landscapes and appreciating them. So our economic welfare has increased either directly or indirectly because of the ecosystem services that nature is providing. And then the final category on the screen about use value is called option value. And this, more simply, is an insurance value. You want to maybe use the environment in the future. You're not using it now, but you may want to use it in the future, and therefore there's an insurance value in keeping the options open. And then across the screen, non-use value has two components: bequest value and existence value. These two components are typically often debated in sustainable development arguments. So bequest value is where we want to conserve the environment in order to pass it on from one generation to the next. And existence value is where we would feel a loss in welfare if elements of nature disappear. So when I talk to my students, I always say, I would feel a loss in welfare if the blue whale species disappeared. I'll never probably see a blue whale up close. And if I did, I might not survive, but I would still feel a loss if it didn't exist anymore. So the challenge in economics is, how do we find monetary equivalents for the various components of use value and non-use value, and find a total economic value for a given ecosystem service or set of services? Okay, now there's some rather difficult philosophy hiding behind valuing nature. And I'm only going to look at the two components marked in blue on the screen. If you want to ask me questions afterwards about the other components, then I'll try and answer it. But economics and monetary valuation only deals with what's called anthropocentric instrumental value and anthropocentric intrinsic value. So instrumental value just relates to the direct and indirect values that we looked at in the last slide, how we make use of the environment and therefore we value it. Anthropocentric intrinsic value is an idea that we as human beings think that part of nature or the whole of nature has intrinsic value in itself. And this comes close to the idea of existence value that we looked at in the last slide. The two other sections of the diagram I'm not going to talk about now, but I'm happy to answer questions about later on. Okay, so one of the points of debate in economic valuation of the environment is that term value doesn't mean the same thing to one stakeholder and another stakeholder. So the diagram is trying to show you that what any one stakeholder means by the nature of value and value of nature depends on how you got that information. So what was the elicitation process you used? Did you conduct a focus group with people and deliberate with them? Or did you find a different method to put the value of nature? Secondly, is the value that you're talking about based on assumption that people only have self-regarding, selfish preferences, and their value relates to that self-regarding perspective? Or do they have values like existence and bequest values, which bring in other individuals and their needs and requirements? The value that you get, therefore, can be different between individuals, communities, and society. And what we talk about in terms of nature's value will be different if we're talking about the value of nature to society or the value to an individual. Okay, so nature's value is a multi-dimensional concept, and that's the reason why we get so much debate between deep ecology, pale green ecology, and economics. What we can try and do in decision support systems is use the tools that economics has developed, try and put as many monetary values as possible on ecosystem services, accepting that it's not possible to put value on all aspects of nature or on all ecosystem services. And the little diagram on the screen now just takes you through the different types of methods that are available from, on the one side, non-monetary qualitative examples. So on your screen, unfortunately, I can see it's blank in terms of examples, but this would be using things like film, pictures, and other non-monetary methods to look at how people value the environment. There are more quantitative, but still non-monetary methods. And in the middle, there are methods that borrow monetary and non-monetary methods. And the two on the right-hand side, as I'm looking at it, are examples of monetary methods where I assume you've been talking about yesterday, and maybe today, in terms of contingent valuation, choice experiments, and travel cost methods. And these are divided into methods that use revealed preference of individuals and stated preference of individuals. So contingent valuation and choice experiments are stated preference methods because they use surveys to ask people questions about willing to pay. The other valuation methods reveal through people's behavior their valuation. So in travel cost terms, we're looking at how much do people spend, what does it cost them to visit a site, and we use that as a proxy for how much value they put on the site. So there's a whole spectrum of methods and techniques available to us to try and help in the decision support system. Okay, so now we come to the overall decision support system known as the balance sheet approach. And this is probably the most controversial part of this talk. So I'll be very careful what I say in this part. This decision support system or process and set of tools is what I am trying to convince the UK government about. So far with some success, but not all success. So what are we looking at here? Well, just imagine that we're trying to decide on a project or a policy to do with environmental management, and we want to know, is this policy the right thing to do or not? Typically, what economists would say is, well, you first need to work out and quantify in monetary terms the gains and losses to society from this project or policy. And we'll do this in terms of costs and benefits. And the analysis is usually conducted through a cost-benefit analysis. As you'll see from the first balance sheet, strategic analysis, we've got our cost-benefit analysis underpinned by an environmental impact assessment or a natural capital assessment. We might even be looking at national income accounts, GDP, but with an environmental dimension built in. And we'll come up with an answer that says, this project or policy that we're looking at does or doesn't pass the cost-benefit test. So it does have a net benefit to society, maybe a net cost, and therefore we don't accept it. The underpinning analysis deals with efficiency. So what we've done in cost-benefit analysis is work out whether something is economically efficient or not in terms of its net benefit or net cost. Now, what we then need to think about is a second part of the balance sheet. Because we are now accepting that sustainable development is an objective that we're looking at, we need to think about whether equity and fairness questions need to be included. So we're not just interested in whether a project or a policy is efficient. We're also interested in, it might be efficient, but is it fair and equitable? And so we need to add on to the cost-benefit analysis an analysis of who gains and who loses in terms of this project and policy. And so we have to go down to the stakeholder level and look at who's gaining, who's losing. And where we find there are substantial numbers of losers from the policy, even though it's an efficient policy, we need to think about compensation measures for those losers. And that takes you into the second balance sheet, where we actually do in detail a compensation and distributional analysis down at the local level. That then in turn may show that this policy or project is very controversial, and therefore we are going to get into stakeholders who hold very different ethical positions and values about nature. And so this typically happens where a project or a policy infringes cultural ecosystem services. It may take away particular forest areas that indigenous people hold as not just their livelihood, but also as sacred areas. It may interfere with landscapes that people have come historically to want to conserve. So that's known as cultural asset loss and leads to a social capital loss. And the third balance sheet then tries to offer various tools to try and get at these losses and the values that are at issue here. So the balance sheet has three overlapping forms of analysis. And whether you use 1, 2, or 3 will depend on how complicated and controversial the project or the policy is. And so we then have a decision support system that is both a process that we've been going through and a set of tools like cost-benefit analysis, input-output analysis, distribution impact analysis to help us guide policymakers through the change context. Okay, so that has been quite a fast run through various projects, policies, and consequences. What it might be now useful to do is for me to take questions, and also I do have an example of the balance sheet actually being applied, which I can take you through should people be interested in that. So Corrado, Jaime, Sylvia, I'm in your hands in terms of questions or other explanations that you might want. Hi. Right. Okay. Yep.
Yeah, now you can.
Okay, so did you hear what I was saying before? So apparently here people want to see or listen to the application, and I guess then we will have questions for you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right. Okay. So I will leave the balance sheet diagram on the screen, and I'll talk about an application of this process and set of tools. So the example is going to be taken from Europe, unfortunately, but I'm going to talk about a problem that we have in Europe with the marine environment and a long-standing problem of pollution in the Baltic Sea region of Europe. Okay, so I don't have a map to show you, so I'll explain. If you don't know where the Baltic Sea is, this is a large body of marine water surrounded by 9 European countries. They're all members of the European Union, except for Russia. These are the Baltic countries are Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Germany, the Baltic states, Poland, and Russia. And there are 9 countries who have an interest in the Baltic Sea, who utilize the ecosystem services from the Baltic Sea, and also pollute the Baltic Sea. So for a decade or more, these Scandinavian countries and Russia have been trying to get an international agreement to clean up the Baltic Sea. And the international arrangement they have is called HELCOM, HELCOM, which is almost an international treaty between these countries. And under HELCOM in 2007, a Baltic Sea action plan was agreed, which had the objectives of significantly reducing pollution by 2050. Okay. Now, the problem in the Baltic Sea is quite a complicated scientific problem. There are a range of pollutants being emitted and discharged into the sea. The Baltic Sea itself has a restricted water flow, so that water coming into the Baltic Sea and leaving the Baltic Sea only happens very slowly. And so pollution that accumulates in the Baltic Sea marine environment tends to be concentrated because of that slow flow. The action plan tried to look at the main causes of pollution in the Baltic and came to an agreement that agriculture and urban wastewater treatment were the main problem areas. And runoff from agriculture in terms of fertilizer and other pesticides, and the discharge of sewage from urban areas without proper treatment caused nitrogen and phosphorus emissions that are basically left areas of the Baltic without any biodiversity. The scientific term for this problem is called eutrophication. Okay, so that was the problem. Over decades of time, these 9 countries have continued to emit pollution and waste into the Baltic, and finally the Baltic has rebelled against human beings and said, that's too much, no more. Okay, so what if we looked at this problem through the perspective of the balance sheet approach? So economists were brought into this problem, and the first thing that economists did was to look at a cost-benefit analysis of the abatement measures that might be available to solve the problem. So the economists identified a range of measures to reduce agricultural pollution, to improve sewage treatment, and to expand wetlands and other ecosystems to buffer the sea against pollution. And the economists worked out a set of cost-effective abatement measures. So given the objective of meeting the 2050 targets for pollution reduction, the idea was, how can we meet those targets for least cost? How can we meet those targets most efficiently? And so a range of measures from agriculture and sewage treatment were proposed and costed. And a contingent valuation study was done across all 9 countries, covering thousands of participants. And the question was, what is your willingness to pay for the abatement measures necessary to meet the abatement objective and clean up the Baltic Sea? So this contingent valuation was trialed in a pilot and then across all the countries. And the answer that came out of the cost benefit was that the benefits that society would derive across the 9 countries was approximately 4,600 million euros per year by 2050. Okay, that's quite a large sum of money. The second part of the cost benefit was then to work out, okay, those are the benefits, but what is it going to cost society to implement those measures? And the analysis came to the conclusion that the costs of pollution abatement varied between 2,300 million euros a year to 2,800 million euros a year. Okay. Right. So from a balance sheet 1 point of view, benefits outweigh the cost. So there was a net gain, according to this analysis, of around 2,300 million euros a year. Okay. So the economists were quite pleased with this result. The environmentalists were happy with the result. The politicians were not happy. I doubt that will surprise anybody in the audience. The reason the politicians weren't happy was that, looking at the balance sheet approach, the next step in the balance sheet is equity and fairness. And it turns out that although there's a net benefit overall, some countries gain, but some countries lose. So, just to give you the full picture, if the Baltic Sea Action Plan was implemented with these cost-effective abatement measures in agriculture and sewage treatment, Finland, Germany, Russia, and Sweden would gain. They will have net benefits from that measure. Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland will lose in that. Okay, so the gainers get more benefits than it costs them to implement the measures. The losers, it costs them more to implement than the gains they get. This clearly was a political problem, and the Baltic countries are now engaged in a process of looking at compensation for the losers And in economic terms, we would say looking at cross subsidies between countries to find a more equitable solution. Coming to the third balance sheet, when the economists and scientists were undertaking the study, they also used a contingent valuation analysis, which looked at shared values across all 9 countries, and found that the respondents did indeed have a collective view on the health of the environment in the Baltic, and from an ecological economics perspective, displayed shared values or other regarding preferences. And there were quite strong forms of evidence to show that they held existent value for the Baltic. The other element in the debate was with the ecological scientists, who pointed out that the cost-benefit analysis didn't take into account threshold effects, tipping points, or irreversible impact, all of which are a risk in the Baltic Sea, and another reason why the action plan should be implemented. So in the real world, we've actually seen the balance sheet in action, going from balance sheet 1 through to distribution in 2 and 3, worries about fairness, rules, shared values, and risk-taking in the environment. The story isn't finished because the politicians continue to debate the issues, and currently we're trying to agree a set of cost-effective abatement measures that could actually be implemented, and compensation measures where appropriate. Okay, so that's the case study.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, you can share, right? You have the paper.
We have the
paper is already.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, the paper is on the folder. So
No, it's not still not, but I will put it.
in the folder. Okay, so
There's a document on this.
it's a bit awkward because I have to speak in 2 microphones. But if you have any questions, if anyone wants to come up here and start asking questions of Kerry, we are going to have some time for that. So who wants to start? Anyone? Yes, you have to come over here because otherwise it doesn't.
So if you can please say your name, your institution, and the question, please. Wait until I put the camera, please.
Professor, I'm Diego Castro from the Environmental National Authority, and my question is related with fairness. What would you suggest for a good indicator of fairness in your strategic analysis?
Okay. If I heard that properly, the question was about fairness.
Yes.
Was that right? Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
So
what you would use as an indicator for fairness?
yeah. Okay. So if you remember, right at the start, I talked about the social welfare function.
Even if we speak there,
Yeah.
so we don't need this.
Yeah.
Yes, but for them to hear.
Yes.
Okay. So in a social welfare function, it's possible to include fairness ideas. So let me take you through an example. So there's There's a UK philosopher called John Rawls who specializes in fairness and justice. And so what he does is to ask you to think about rules for justice, which I think is what your question is. Yeah. So think about a society. Well, I'll make this real. Everybody in the room I'm looking at, you are society. John Rawls now asks you to be representatives of society, and he asks you to decide on a fairness rule in society. Right, so the difficulty he's going to cause you is that in this discussion you're going to have, you don't know whether you're rich, poor, or in the middle. And the rather technical term in English is you have a veil of ignorance placed on you. Okay? So you don't know if you're rich, poor, or in the middle. Luckily, you do know that you're alive. And John Rawls says, what rules would you come up with? And one of the main rules that he argues you'll come up with is that the least well off in your society should have a reasonable standard of living, reasonable access to different forms of capital and nature. And that the rest of society should make sure that the least well off have a reasonable standard of living. That's known as the maxi-min rule. And it underpins most of the welfare states in Europe and their social policy. Yeah? Okay. So the next question for Rawls is, what about future generations? And the argument here is that now you're all representatives, but now it's really bad for you because you don't know whether you're in this generation or a future generation. So now I've made you all possible people rather than real people. Okay. Same Rawls question. What is a fair rule across generations? And the argument you come up with is the capital stock of nature that's passed on from one generation to the next as a bequest should be at least equal, hopefully better, but at least constant over time. So there are two rules: intergenerational and intra-generational fairness rules. And so the cost-benefit analysis and resource allocation should be looking to reduce inequality in the current generation and to maintain capital and nature across generations, which is what sustainable development should be about.
Thank you, Kerry. And I think obviously there are other possible rules that you can include, but yes,
Here's
Yes,
another
there is
question.
another one. Two of you, I mean, okay, take turns and I guess, okay.
Yes.
This is for the benefit of the room and
And this is for the benefit
so,
of
okay.
So, hello, Kerry. This
Hello.
is Juan Pablo, and
Hello.
now from Universidad de los Andes.
Yep.
And my question is related. So I think this was a very interesting example of a case study where politicians did not agree or were concerned about the intervention.
Yeah.
My question is related in another possible scenario where possibly economists and environmentalists would not agree, because this was the case, which I believe is rarely the case, where environmentalists and economists agree. So my question is related to how would you proceed, or if you have any insights or examples about how to proceed with this balance sheet approach if there are trade-offs or concerns or differences between environmentalists and economists.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good question. I don't have a definitive answer, but what the balance sheet tries to do in balance sheet 3 is to give all stakeholders a role to play in terms of different values, different ideas, different assumptions. And so you're still going to have to come to a decision at the end of the day, but at least stakeholders won't be able to say they weren't consulted, nobody asked them about their views in that third balance sheet. We are asking everybody for their views and then trying to come to a decision. The idea in the balance sheet is that we turn people's vague ideas or expressions of interest and quantify them as much as possible, so that they can at least see that their side of things, their perspective was taken into account, but there were other perspectives equally valid that people were concerned about. So the balance sheet tries to substitute away from a situation where environmental scientists and the economists agree on a cost-benefit outcome with a net benefit, but it has losers involved in it. And nobody has thought about these losers, which then brings politicians into conflict with the technical people. So the idea behind the balance sheet is to at least ask distribution questions and other valuation questions and show how we can try and quantify some of these different interest groups. Ultimately, my position is that economists and environmental scientists' job is to put this technical information into the policy process, and then it's up to elected politicians to take decisions. What the elected decision makers can't claim is that they didn't know about this interest group or that interest group. All the information is put in front of them, but they are elected to take a decision.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question.
Yeah.
Hello, Professor Turner. Thank you very much for that very interesting talk. My name is Fernando Arbeláez from Fundación Universal Colombia. I have two questions for you.
Okay.
One of them is about what you just talked about, equity and winners and losers. I was wondering, I assume that the different groups within the countries were also taken into account for the equity analysis. Like I was thinking, for example, farmers who have to reduce their emissions, runoffs, and all that. probably farmers from Latvia are going to have a much larger problem dealing with that than some cities in Sweden, for example.
Yes.
So yeah, I was wondering if, apart from inter-country analysis, that was also taken into account, like the different groups inside the countries. And the other question is regarding threshold.
Yeah.
Because you would think that in this case, lots of ecological thresholds were crossed. So probably there are lots of irreversible processes that already happened. And I was wondering if that's not counterproductive, because that could mean that maybe it's not worth doing that investment because many things that were there are never going to be there anymore.
Right. Yep. Okay. Two good questions. First question. Well, yes, part of the analysis and research that's going on now is to bring this analysis down to individual stakeholders and their gains and losses. So the analysis that I presented in that little example was a macro analysis, not micro. One of the things that we're finding is that there are a set of abatement measures that don't cost very much and that can be implemented in all 9 countries. And they typically relate to using wetlands and other habitats as ecosystem service providers, which, while not completely free, are very low cost abatement measures. As you would expect, the most expensive measures are building new sewage treatment plants in countries that don't currently have that investment. So that type of analysis is going on. How do we find a set of measures for the absolute least cost, and typically measures that all the countries can engage in? The second question, really good question. The scientists believe that it is possible to save large portions of the Baltic Sea and the biodiversity in it if these abatement measures are brought in relatively quickly and are maintained until 2050. There will be small areas where the eutrophication has got to such a level that life can't exist. But the benefit, if there is a benefit of eutrophication, is that it is reversible to a greater or lesser extent. There are, however, threshold effects related to toxic pollutants, which are accumulating in sediments in the Baltic Sea, which are much more difficult to handle. And we've more recently found that sediments in marine environments, particularly in shelf seas, are huge storers of carbon, and so are very important in terms of climate change abatement and mitigation. And disturbing the sediments you would lose that carbon storage. So there are lots of unanswered scientific questions, but it's not a situation that's hopeless. It is a situation in which some restoration of the Baltic environment is possible, albeit maybe not to the pristine level of the 18th century.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. We have another one.
Hello, Professor Turner. My name is Andres Martino. I work at the Simchi Institute. My question has to do with the use value option and the non-use value, say the existence value.
Yep.
So I'm thinking about, well, I basically don't understand the difference because, let's say, in the existence value, by existing, it will possibly become a direct or indirect use value in the future. It will have an indirect or direct use in the future. So just does that just depend on our current understanding? The difference between those two?
Okay, thank you. Yes, to some extent. The idea behind existence value is that you may never, as an individual, use the environment or use a particular ecosystem service, but your well-being and welfare will reduce if some of these ecosystem services are lost. So you actually value their existence over time, even though you may never use them. Yeah. And I'll take you back to, can you guys still see the screen?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
So can take you back to that little diagram where I said I wouldn't talk about the bottom two concepts. Okay, thinking about the bottom right, non-anthropocentric intrinsic value. This is an idea that deep ecologists hold central to their philosophy. The argument is that the existence of nature is in and of itself intrinsically valuable. Now, just like the John Rawls example, I'll play another silly game with you. How can you think about non-anthropocentric intrinsic value? So this is the value of nature that has got nothing to do with people. It's quite a difficult concept to get hold of. So here's a silly example. Imagine that you are, sorry, you're all going to be philosophers again now for a minute. So imagine that there's a planet, and we'll call it Earth 2. And this planet has everything that Earth has got, everything our planet has got, except for people. Okay? For some ecological evolutionary reason, people don't exist on this planet. Okay. Now, people will never know about this planet. It's out in the cosmos somewhere, but we'll never know whether it exists or not. And there are no people on it. I ask you the question, is that planet too valuable? If
There's some doubts here. We're thinking.
so if you are drawn to that idea intuitively, because I can't give you any empirical evidence, then you are close to accepting non-anthropocentric intrinsic value. If you think that that game was the silliest thing I've said today, and that without people and nature and the relationship between them, there isn't anything that we can call a value relationship, then you reject that idea. And just to finish the answer, on Tuesday this week, I was giving a presentation in Norwich here to a group of people in the government and in the churches in Norwich. And I was arguing this intrinsic value idea with them there, and got into a lot of trouble over this idea. The problem with it is that in this meeting on Tuesday, at least 3/4 of the audience liked the idea of non-anthropocentric intrinsic value. Some of them from a spiritual point of view, others from a secular point of view, but at least 75% of them. You see, so different audiences have a different reaction to things. So just to upset this audience, I then pointed out that if you do like non-anthropocentric intrinsic value, you then have to think about the rights and interests of non-human nature. And the problem you run into is that our economic and social systems that we have do degrade nature, do infringe other non-human nature, and that is an ethical problem if you believe in intrinsic value in nature. The problem you have philosophically is, does all nature, animate and inanimate, have rights and interests or not? And there isn't an answer from the philosophers. Some people think if parts of nature feel pleasure and pain, it's called sentience, then they should have rights and interests. Some people claim that mountains and rocks should have rights and interests. I'm not clear as an economist how I can design an economic system that does no damage to any non-human nature. I've just moved my feet while making that statement, and I've probably crushed millions of microbes at that moment in time.
Okay, thank you, Professor Turner. With what you mentioned, that there's a very interesting case here in Colombia with what you just mentioned, and it's the Amazon is now subject to rights. Yes, so that is an interesting case.
And also in Ecuador.
Here in Colombia.
And also in Ecuador. Ecuador was the first one.
Okay, Colombia and Ecuador.
Okay, that was intense. Okay, anyone else?
Yes, we do have some more minutes. Okay.
Yeah, we have 5 more minutes. So
5 more minutes. So.
Fine, yeah.
I was scared by the.
Now they're all thinking about the little planet up there. So actually, it's a nice scam, because if they have value, you can extract value from them and get some money to protect the planet nobody understands the laws. It's great. The money.
You make a business on
Yeah.
this.
Okay, I think that we are at the moment between dazed and overwhelmed, and very appreciative of the talk so far. And so, if there are no other questions, I would like to thank you very much. It was, as usual, a pleasure listening to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for allowing me to give the talk. I enjoyed it despite the distance between us and the technological communication problems. I'm now going to put the microphone down because my hand has gone to sleep.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you. See you soon.